Hi class, welcome back. We are continuing through and going to end actually Unit I on the introductory unit in Business 306. We're going to be looking at pages I7 to I9. By the way, I've got the grandkids upstairs and they're thumping around. They might be yelling. I don't know if you'll be able to hear them at times, but my apologies if you do. Anyways, in this last section here, what I want to do is to take a look at, well, what makes a newspaper article or a statistical study that you read in, say, a journal good or not? That is, good from a statistical point of view or from a reporting point of view. And so we're going to take a look actually at a couple of newspaper articles. Both of them are a little on the funny side, and ask the question, well, are these good articles? Because I want you to be critical consumers of statistics. Now, ideally, you should be going to things like recognized academic journals and taking a look at the studies there. But most people actually don't read those unless you're interested in a particular subject. And yet you're going to have tons of stuff that comes across your desk through the newspaper or, of course, through social media. And the big term nowadays, of course, is fake news. And so we really want to take a look at this whole thing about, well, can you believe everything that you read? And what are some of the questions that you should be throwing at an article when you're reading it to see if this is a good study or is this not a good study? Okay? So what I'd like you to do here is just pause and read the Elvis Lives example right now. I'm not going to read through it because you can just simply pause it and read it yourself. But pause that now, read through, and then we're going to take a look at some of the questions that you should throw at that. Okay, I'm going to assume that you have read this, and I guess I'd be interested in finding out how many of you think that Elvis is alive, but I can't really see your hands right now, so it does say 10% of Canadians believe this Elvis is alive and still may be rocking, the Gallup poll suggests. Is this a good statistical study, and is this a good article? And my guess is that the answer that I usually get when I ask this question is no and no. And I want to challenge you a little bit on this. First of all, as I mentioned, you're absolutely right in terms of if we're comparing this to something that you would read in a statistical journal or any academic journal, then the answer is going to be no, this is not. This is just a newspaper article. But compared to other stuff that you read in the newspapers, I'm hoping that I convince you that actually this is not a bad study and not a bad reporting of it. So here's some of the questions that you should throw at an article here. And I've got them listed down here, and so you might want to copy them down, or of course you've got access to this video so you can come back and take a look at them. The who and the why. So who is it that is gathering the data? And who is it for, and why was the study done? That's really important to ask those questions. In terms of the who, let's just take a look here at, let's do green today. Let's take a look at who's actually doing it, and it's Gallup. By the way, that is spelled wrong. Right there, it should be G-A-L-L-U-P. That was my mistake. But you'll notice that Gallup is mentioned a few times through here. Gallup is one of the recognized polling organizations in particularly the States, but they also do stuff in Canada. And so because Gallup is doing it, then there's a good name behind it. That's not to say that every survey that they do is the best or doesn't have problems, but right away we've got credibility. Now, the other thing, too, is that this is just a general interest poll here. And so there isn't any suspicion that we might have as to who is behind this thing. Why is this being done? Is there any particular motivation behind it that might be biasing the results? We're going to talk more about that when we get into 307 if you continue on with the follow-up course to this. But when I take a look at this, the who and the why say there's nothing here that raises a red flag, and in fact there's a green flag in terms of that it's Gallup doing it. Next question down here is in the what, and it says, what data did they gather? When were the results reported? That actually should have probably been in the when section. And what questions were asked? And actually they do a pretty good job in terms of that. So what they do down here is they say that they asked a question. Where do we say here? They were asked if, do you believe that Elvis is still alive? So that was the question that they asked. So they're telling you actually right in the article exactly what they asked. And this is a question which is not really ambiguous. It's a yes-no kind of thing. Well, do you think he's alive or not? It's an easy question to answer. It's not a, well, it depends kind of thing, right? So it's an unambiguous question, and they've told you exactly what they're asking. And so this is actually a good stats thing, and this is also good from a reporting point of view. When were the results reported here? Well, what we don't have here actually is when this was actually reported, when this particular newspaper article came out. I don't actually have that anymore. We do have when it was done, and it was done on February 8th to the 11th of that particular year. So I'm assuming that it came out, soon after that. That's the thing. Now, the only question I'd have on that is that was there anything specific about February 8th to the 11th that they would be asking this particular question? And so in that particular year, you might want to ask questions like, well, when was Elvis born? Is this close to the anniversary of his birth? Or is it close to the anniversary of his death, or his supposed death in this particular case? Or did they just finish running a big TV special on the life of Elvis, and so therefore it's very much in the news? Those are the kind of things that can bias the results. Now, we don't have the answers to that, but those are the sort of questions that you want to ask whenever you read an article that may actually show that there's some bias in this. When and how, down here it says, when was it gathered? So we've taken a look at that. When was the sample, what was the sample size, what method, and so on, and is there a reported margin of error? So what it says down here, this is the important part here that says, hey, this is actually a pretty good reporting of a study. They asked 1,024 Canadians in telephone interviews, do you believe that Elvis Presley is still alive? So they've told you the sample size, they've told you the method that they've done it by telephone, and they've told you the questions that they've asked. This is really good, actually. What they haven't said really is how did they actually choose the people? And the only thing that I can say in terms of that is in terms of just some inside information that Gallup tends to use statistically proper techniques in terms of randomly selecting telephone numbers and then phoning people. So you'd only know that if you knew a little bit about Gallup. But a newspaper article isn't going to say that. However, if you're reading this as an academic journal, they would actually have a section on methodology where they would talk about these things and then go into them in more detail. So you could look and say, oh, okay, good. They used simple random sampling within a stratified, using a stratified method or something like that. And so it's something where you can look and check off that particular box. The last part down here talks about the 4 percentage point margin of error 19 times in 20. And that's actually a really important statement to put in. It's important to calculate, and it's also important to put that in every newspaper article that is reporting a study here. But at this point in the course, you really don't know what that means. I can tell you that it means we're 95% certain that our survey results show us that, let's see, it was 10% of Canadians believe that Elvis is alive and rocking, plus or minus 4 percentage points. So anywhere from 6 to 14% of people believe that he is alive, and we're 95% sure of that. We can't be 100% sure because we haven't sampled all Canadians. By the way, a question that I always ask students if we're doing this face-to-face is, what do you think of the sample size? Do you think that it is too small? And most students will say, yeah, like how can 1,024 people represent all of Canadians? And here's the thing is that actually 1,024 is a pretty good sample size as long as it is selected well. And Gallup is pretty good at that in terms of selecting people from each of the different provinces and using some sort of random method where no bias is entered into it. And so, again, we would have a checkbox there and say that that is good. So in terms of the who, the what, the where, when, and why, and the how, they actually pass on flying colors here. This question down here, are there any extraneous or sensational statements? And here's where I would tend to say, here, let me just change colors here and say, this kind of stuff here, where we're talking about Elvis is being spotted working in car washes and greasy diners, and then it talks about somebody here seeing him in a white jumpsuit or in a bowl of oatmeal. That's kind of sensationalist stuff, and it doesn't really help. So it's good for reading in a newspaper, but in terms of, say, an academic journal, you would want to have all the different comments that people have in, say, an appendix that they could reference and see everything that was said there. It's also interesting that the question itself was a simple yes-no question, and so it's interesting that they would even include that, because that wasn't really one of the questions in the survey, right? This was just additional information that people added on that. So it's interesting that they even recorded that information there. So that's maybe a black mark against them. That's not great. Are there any confusing statements? When I go through this with a class, a lot of students here have trouble with this one here that says, of the 10%, 5% think that the king of rock and roll lives, and the rest will only be say that they aren't sure that he's dead. So that's a little confusing. And then this one here, 10% of Quebecers firmly believe that he's still alive. Another 5% that they have some doubt. So a couple of comments about those. First of all, this first one here, where it's talking about of the 10%, 5% say that. From a mathematical point of view, we're talking 5% of 10% is 0.5%. I think what they meant is half of the 10%. So 5% in total. And so that could have been written a little better, because really it's saying 0.5%. That would be 5% of 10%. The other thing down here in terms of the Quebec is a number of people have pointed this out and said, well, why is it talking about Quebecers? Did they only poll Quebecers? And the answer is no, they actually polled Canadians. And what they're saying here is that Quebecers differ from the rest of Canadians in terms of their beliefs there. If you were reading this in an academic journal, what they would do is they would actually have the percentage breakdown for each province or each region. And so again, this is something that they could have done better. So overall, when you take a look at these questions, you would say, this is actually probably a pretty good study in terms of how it was done. Not necessarily an important study, of course, but it's a good study in terms of how it was done when you take a look at the different questions that we throw at it. In terms of the reporting, it was generally done well, recognizing that this is not an academic journal, but they're putting in a lot of the stuff here that we want to see in terms of good reporting. So I would give this particular one a big check mark. What I want you to do for homework is I'd like you to take a look at the Ann Landers article right here. Now, this was actually a November 1992 one, but I've used it for many years because it's an awesome example here of, well, I'll let you decide whether it's a good or a bad one, and just throw the questions at it. And we will actually take that up in class. The last page here talks about the Literary Digest poll, and I would like to just spend a couple of moments on this. This actually, the Literary Digest poll was really influential in getting the science of statistics going. And so let me just quickly read through this. It says, shortly before the 36th presidential election in the United States, Literary Digest, which was a big, prestigious publication, had successfully called the winner in every presidential election since 1916. And they predicted that Alfred Landon of Kansas would be the overwhelming victor over the incumbent FDR, so Roosevelt, who was predicted to only secure 43%. Now, Roosevelt had been the president for a year. The country was struggling in the Depression, all that kind of stuff here. Down here, it says that the Literary Digest poll was one of the largest polls ever conducted. 10 million people were mailed the questionnaire. Their names and addresses came from sources such as telephone books and club membership lists. Now, 2.4 million people responded. That's a lot of people. Predicting an easy win for Landon. Instead, Roosevelt won by a landslide, getting 62% of the vote. What went wrong? So I'd like you to pause it at this point and give some thoughts as to why, what went wrong. And so I'll let you pause that. And now I'm going to assume that you've given it some thought. And I'll tell you what the problems were. There's two main problems here. The first one here is that the sample didn't represent the whole population. Why? Well, how did they get the survey out? They got the survey out to people by sources such as telephone books and club membership lists. Now, you got to think back in 1936, who owned telephones and who was a member of a club. And that's the problem, is that we're dealing with the middle and the upper class people at that point. So they're not even contacting the lower class people. The second thing is this thing that we call non-response bias. The non-response bias has to do with what are the characteristics. Here, let me write that better. What are the characteristics of those who didn't respond? See, the problem when you're dealing with mail-out surveys is that you might get back 2.4 million people, but that's 24%. That means that 76% of the people did not respond. So who responded? The people that were disgruntled and wanted some sort of change. The people who were happy with the status quo, FDR, they didn't even respond. And so what happened then was that we ended up with FDR getting 62% of the vote. So those are the two big questions, or the two big problems that we have with the Literary Digest poll, and things that you want to consider when you're taking a look at doing a survey. Are you reaching the actual population, a good representative sample, reaching the whole population? And what about the people that didn't respond? That's why things like face-to-face surveys are better if you can do that. However, especially in a world of COVID, we can't do that, and so we do have to rely on things like mail-out surveys, email surveys, internet surveys, things like that. And so there is this big problem with non-response bias. All right, that ends the unit. That's where we're going to end it here. Remember that I want you to take a look at this Ann Landers article here and ask these questions here on the previous page. And I will talk to you at a later time.